I'm sure most of you remember the interview I conducted with Julian Fellowes, the writer behind Downton Abbey, and why that series so impressed me, and apparently also Tony Abbott, with its multiple stories and themes interwoven as England and Europe braced for World War, and really about the changing of one society, the evolution of one society into another. Well, another impressive work landed on my desk recently, dramatising the destruction of one world and the creation of another after World War II. It's called Savage Continent, and in it, the author and historian Keith Lowe describes Europe between 1944 and 49 and how the events and indeed the moral code of that time, or the lack of it, laid down foundations for years to come that we're still grappling with. Here's one of his quotes, and I think it sums up some of his material. "It was virtually impossible," he writes, "to emerge from the Second World War without enemies. There can hardly be a better demonstration than this of the moral and human legacy of the war. After the desolation of entire regions, the butchery of over 35 million people, countless massacres in the name of nationality, race, religion, class or personal prejudice, virtually every person on the continent had suffered some kind of loss or injustice. In fact, the traditional view that the war came to an end when Germany surrendered in May 45 is entirely misleading. Their capitulation only brought an end to one aspect of the fighting." Well, we thought here on Saturday Extra it was pertinent to look at those critical years, how they changed Europe, but also, in the light of what's been happening in the Middle East, in particular Syria at the moment, to understand how, as individuals and nations, you recover, if you ever do, from such terrible turmoil. Keith Lowe, an historian and author, joins me now on the line from his home in North London. Welcome to the program, Keith.
Thanks for having me.
Loads and loads of different particulars that I will get into over the time of the interview. But overall, what is the legacy, would you say, of these post-World War II years? How did those years of utter chaos lay the foundation for Europe today?
Well, I think we've got a lot of cosy myths about the way the war ended. We're used to seeing photographs of people cheering on the street on VE Day, sailors kissing nurses in New York, and so on. But those really are myths. The war didn't simply stop. People carried on murdering each other, raping, pillaging, looting, all kinds of really quite horrible behaviour, simply because all of the institutions that normally control this sort of behaviour, governments, police forces and so on, all of that had been swept away. And so in the aftermath of the war, there was a sort of complete power vacuum, which was filled with this chaos for years. I suppose the real legacy that we have today is that we have imposed new institutions on Europe. I mean, the biggest one, of course, is the European Union, which was really formed out of a fear of repeating all this kind of behaviour.
Well, it was really like a reinvention of a whole set of entities. I just have to read from your introduction, which I think is one of the more remarkable introductions I've read recently. Imagine a world without institutions, a world where borders between countries seem to have dissolved. There are no governments anymore on either a national scale or even a local one. No schools, universities, no libraries, no access to any information whatsoever. There are no banks, but that's no great hardship because money no longer has any worth. Law and order are virtually non-existent because there's no police force, no judiciary. Men with weapons roam the streets. Women of all classes and ages prostitute themselves for food and protection. There's no shame, there's no morality, there's only survival. Now, that does sound, as you say, like a Hollywood script, Keith, but
absolutely.
Presumably there are hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people, some of whom may be listening right now, who can remember just this.
Yeah, I interviewed quite a few of them during the course of the research for the book, and some of the stories that they told me would, make your hair stand up on end. There was one particular guy, I remember, a man called Andrzej, who was actually just a child at the time. And he was from Poland. He had been kidnapped from Warsaw, where he'd lived, and made to work on a farm as a slave labourer with his mother. And after the war, of course, Poland's now a communist country, so the family didn't want to go back, and they got put up in this displaced persons camp. And he told me stories about the things he used to do as a 9-year-old boy. He used to go out into the woods looking for things to play with. He said that once he and his mates kind of broke into this ammunition dump and stole a Panzerfaust, a small German bazooka. And these 9-year-olds used to have great fun firing this thing across the valley and watching the explosions they caused. Another time he said that he found a whole load of German machine gun ammunition, which they shoved into a stove that they found lying around, and then set fire to that and watched all the bullets fly out of this thing till it was peppered like a sieve. So you can imagine, if 9-year-olds are able to get hold of this sort of stuff, adults can easily get hold of it. So, there was a lot of violence, there was a lot of access to weaponry in Europe.
Well, you say that a lot of the shaping of Europe was based on vengeance. And vengeance is a constant theme of your book, as you say, and that you came to realise you had to understand its logic and the purposes to which it was put if you want to understand properly the atmosphere of post-war Europe. And yet you say most historians shy away from this.
Well, it's one of those subjects it sets off all kinds of alarm bells in all kinds of people. It's a touchy subject for lots of different nationalities. I mean, after the end of the war, there were so many different groups that hated each other because, of course, when the Germans invaded places like Poland or Yugoslavia and so on, they set the local populations against one another so that they'd, be busy fighting each other rather than fighting the Germans. So once the Germans were then removed, you suddenly have civil wars breaking out all over the place. And the places which immediately spring to mind are Yugoslavia, where the Croats and the Serbs fought each other throughout the war and continued to do so afterwards. Also, Ukraine and Poland. The Ukrainians didn't want Poles in what they saw as Ukraine, but equally the Poles saw that bit of Ukraine as part of Poland, so they had a virtual civil war there too. So there's a lot of unfinished business after the war, which was sorted out to a certain degree, but there are still undercurrents there today. I mean, if you go to Ukraine and Poland today, there are still people there who are campaigning to get rid of their Poles or to get rid of their Ukrainians and so on.
Well, indeed, there's a great deal of ethnic cleansing occurs in this period. And one of the critics I noticed said, you don't say it out loud, but in a sense, the Nazis' ethnic purity really did win because Europe was left far less multicultural, as we would say, pluralistic, after the war than it was before, wasn't it?
Not so much in the West. I mean, in the West, places like France and Britain and so on actually became much more multicultural because suddenly you have armies coming over from the Commonwealth, from India, so on. So there, the multiculturalism really begins after the war. But once you get into Eastern Europe, it's exactly the opposite. And Poland is a perfect example. Poland was probably the most multicultural place in Europe before the war. The Nazis came in, they got rid of all the Jews. After the war, the Poles kind of finished that job off. They also expelled a lot of their Ukrainians. I mean, these were things that they thought they were doing for the good of the country because these were the issues that had started the war in the first place, as far as they were concerned. So in order to stop it happening again, they thought the best thing to do was just to kick out all their different nationalities and keep Poland just for the Poles.
And I mean, leaving aside the horrors, did you come to, you say you had to find a logic, you had to absorb yourself in the logic of the people. Did you come to have any sympathy with this approach?
Well, it's very difficult to get into the mindset of people. I mean, you've got to remember, these are people who've experienced 6 years of extreme violence, day on day. A lot of them had been forced into committing that violence themselves. It's very difficult to put yourself into the sort of mindset where you've had this done to you repeatedly through a number of years, and you can't react in a way which we would consider normal. We fortunately, thank God, haven't experienced this ourselves.
Keith Lowe is my guest on Saturday Extra. He's written a remarkable book called Savage Continent, Europe in the Aftermath of World War II. Getting back to some of the more tragic innocents being really dealt terrible hands after the war, you talk about the children fathered by German men And this wasn't just after the war, but well into the 60s in some countries. What's the psychology, I suppose, of punishing the most vulnerable, the utterly innocent, after the fighting has stopped? I wonder what lasting effect this has had.
Well, yes. It actually starts with the persecution of their mothers. They kind of became scapegoats after the war because rather than rounding up the real collaborators, they took the sort of most emotional route and rounded up the women who had slept with German soldiers. They became sort of symbolic and shaved their heads and humiliated them and so on. But as a consequence of this, everybody knew who these women were, and when they had illegitimate children by these German soldiers, sort of shunning continued with the children. So children who were at school were shunned by their teachers. They were humiliated in front of their classes. So the whole community all over Europe kind of shunned these children. As a consequence, I mean, there was a big study done about this in Norway a few years ago, where they mapped out the life chances of children who had had German fathers, and they found that children of German soldiers ended up less well educated, they got worse jobs, worse health, higher divorce rates, and lower life expectancy. I mean, all the things that we come to think of as being a happy and normal life were jeopardized purely by the fact that they had a German father.
And then there was the treatment of the women, the horizontal collaborators as they became known.
Yes.
And you say, very interestingly, I thought, this wasn't just about punishment or about scapegoating. It was about reinforcing masculinity, particularly in France.
Well, yes. I mean, imagine what it must have been like to be a French man during the war. I mean, all the Americans and the British and the Australians and so on, they're all going out and fighting a manly fight against Germany, and you, as a Frenchman, are powerless.
You're occupied.
The way governments reacted and so on. So they were kind of emasculated by the war. Now, once the Allies got into France, they suddenly had a chance to, show their strength, their manhood. And I mean, this was put in those terms during the time. So they went out and they got themselves machine guns and bandoliers of ammunition and used to go around the streets sort of firing these things off, demonstrating their newfound force. But the darker side of this was, of course, any woman who had slept with a German, which is kind of symbolic of their emasculation, isn't it? They took their revenge on those women.
Well, you actually say that what people have found as a result of asking questions was that the women in some places like, say, Denmark, wartime pollsters were shocked to discover that 51% of Danish women openly admitted to finding German men more attractive than their own compatriots. So this is like intensely insulting, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Imagine how you would feel if you were a Danish man sort of discovering that. I mean, a lot of European women did have German boyfriends. They found them more attractive. They were the conquerors. They were the strong ones. You know, in Norway, for example.
Very Darwinian, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm afraid so. Yeah. I mean, in Norway, about 10% of the female population between 18 and 30 years old had a German boyfriend.
Really? Gosh.
Yes. In France, there are estimated to be about 80,000 illegitimate children by German soldiers. So that shows the scale of horizontal collaboration, as it's called.
Of course, on the other hand, the statistics you have about the number of women who were raped during and after the war were truly disturbing. And I remember reading this in Anthony Beevor's book, Berlin, which I actually had to put aside after a while because I found it too distressing. But in Berlin, I think you estimate 110,000 women are thought to have been raped. In Vienna, 87,000 women, and with a lot of violence. Did anybody talk about this?
Well, it was a taboo subject for years and years. I mean, talking about that Anthony Beevor book, one of the sources he used, which is now quite a famous source, is a memoir by an anonymous memoir by a woman in Berlin. Now, that wasn't even published in Germany until the 1990s, I think. I mean, people tried to publish it, but nobody wanted to know. But I suppose it was a bit raw at the time, and everyone just wanted to brush it under the carpet. Keith,
I suppose in a sense it does all bring us to morality and what happens to it when you're starving, food becomes more important than anything else. You quote the great Australian journalist Alan Moorhead, who was in Naples immediately after its liberation, and he wrote of the, quotes, whole list of sordid human vices. What we're witnessing, in fact, was the moral collapse of a people. Now, what I'd like to ask you in the last few moments is, how does this morality return? How do you reinvent a moral code?
Well, we're back to the myths again, I'm afraid. All the different nationalities around Europe have created their own sort of national myths about the way they behaved during the war. I mean, if they actually looked at the reality, it would be difficult to get that sort of sense of personal pride back that's required to be a moral person. So they created these national myths. So, for example, everybody in France was in the resistance during the war. And likewise, in Italy, the fascists didn't really count. Everybody was in the resistance, even those who weren't communists and so on. Everybody joined in to kick out the Germans. And it's really by making the Germans the sort of pariahs of Europe, all the evils that all the local people did to each other and to others could be pushed off onto Germans. So for years and years and years, and still even really to a tiny degree
that's playing out
today.
Now, isn't it, with the economic situation?
Well, absolutely. And you've got people in Greece demonstrating, calling the Germans Nazis all over again. If you can put all the bad things that you've done and put them onto something else, then you can then rebuild a sense of personal and national pride and rebuild your morality. That's what happened after the war.
Let's end on a good note. The dilemma all countries face, I suppose, we're told never to forget, but you say that remembering these events and wars and atrocities can actually keep alive those national and cultural divisions and reinforcing an us versus them. Who has done it well, in your view? Have you seen a model that you think is a genuine model of good adaptation after such a terrible conflagration?
Well, yes. Firstly, those who have done it badly, the immediate example that springs to mind is Yugoslavia in the 1990s, where they resurrected exactly the same things that had happened during the war and just started it all up again. But when you look at other countries, places like Poland and Germany, there have been all kinds of efforts at reconciliation, which are now bearing huge fruit all in both countries. The atmosphere between Germany and Poland today is probably better than it's ever been. And it's purely because, especially on the Polish side, it has to be said at the beginning, they went all out to try and say, look, let's put the past behind us. These are the terrible things that you did, but we're not going to go into that because we did terrible things too. And we'll put the past behind us. We'll just start again. And, for example, over their borders, Poland took a huge chunk of Germany after the war. They ratified that, said, we're going to draw a line under this. You've got that territory. We're not going to come back and fight over it. So that's the kind of thing you need to do.
Oh, and they set up a Polish-German commission set up to revise history textbooks. How clever is that?
Yes, to try and bring these things, not just amongst obscure academics, but to bring them to the proper public attention so that everybody understands the issues that are underlying the relationship between Germany and Poland today.
So in other words, you don't obliterate it, you actually
don't obliterate it, but you have
contextualise it.
You have to contextualise it, and you have to be very sensitive about each other's national sensibilities.
Oh, Keith Lowe, there's a lot more we could talk about, but thank you so much for joining us. I really do appreciate your time and all the incredible effort you've put into assembling these stories. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Keith Lowe is an historian and author. His book is Savage Continent, Europe in the Aftermath of World War II. It's published by Viking, and it's a riveting read. Very much welcome your responses. You might have lived through some of that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.